The village of St. Aldrich was the kind of place where time moved gently, as if reluctant to disturb the peace of its thatched cottages. Cobbled lanes and flower-laden hedgerows nestled between two rolling hills. It was known for its picturesque charm, the impeccable manners of its inhabitants, and a resolute belief that scandal was something that happened elsewhere. But even in the quietest of villages, secrets lingered beneath the surface. On this particular afternoon, the gardens of Rosewood Manor, home to the esteemed Lady Margaret Fawcett, were filled with guests attending the annual summer garden party event that had, over the years, become a highlight of the St. Aldrich social calendar. The sun cast golden patterns through the trees, dappling the pristine white tablecloths, where plates of cucumber sandwiches, scones, and shortbread biscuits lay waiting to be devoured. A string quartet played softly under the shade of an old oak, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of roses and freshly cut grass. It was, in all respects, a perfect summer's day, and yet, if one were observant enough, fifth one, for example, happened to be Miss Jane Marple, sitting quietly with a cup of Earl Grey in hand, one might have noticed the faintest ripple of unease beneath the laughter and polite conversation. Miss Marple had seen enough of human nature to recognize when something was not quite right. From her comfortable seat near the rose trellis, Miss Marple let her sharp blue eyes drift over the assembled guests, each one engaged in conversation, laughter, or quiet observation of their own. Colonel Godfrey, a retired army man with a bristling white mustache, stood near the refreshments table, regaling an unfortunate listener with yet another tale of his days in India. He was a man who had spent so long reliving his past glories that he had quite forgotten to live in the present. Beside him, Mrs. Clara Redfern, the postmistress, leaned in toward the ever-inquisitive Mrs. Weatherby, her voice lowered conspiratorially. No doubt she was dispensing information regarding the latest letters that had passed through her hands, though she would, of course, insist that she never read other people's correspondence. Meanwhile, Lady Margaret's nephew, Andrew Braithwaite, a handsome young man with restless energy, stood near the gazebo in what appeared to be an animated discussion with Evelyn Trevelyan, a woman who had returned to St. Aldrich after many years away. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on them for a moment. There was something in Evelyn's posture, quiet tension beneath her polite smile, as though she were bracing herself for something yet to come. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people often revealed their true selves in such small, unconscious gestures, and Evelyn's nervous energy suggested that she was not entirely at ease in St. Aldrich. But before she could dwell on the matter further, a sudden, sharp gasp broke through the afternoon air. A glass shattered against the stone pathway. Heads turned in unison near the garden's entrance. Mrs. Willoughby, a stout woman prone to dramatic reactions, had pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide with shock. She was staring at a figure standing at the threshold of Rosewood Manor's gardens. A hush fell over the gathering. The woman before them was tall and elegant, her figure framed against the sunlight. She wore a navy blue traveling coat buttoned to the throat, and a matching hat perched at an angle that suggested effortless sophistication. Her dark hair was tucked neatly beneath it, and though her expression was calm, her eyes held something deeper, something unreadable. Miss Marple did not recognize her, but others did. Lady Margaret Fawcett, standing just a few feet away, had gone white as a sheet. Her teacup trembled in her hand. "Vivian," she whispered. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Vivian Denham, a name not spoken in 20 years. The woman who had vanished from St. Aldrich, leaving behind nothing but whispers, scandal, and a lingering sense of mystery. Miss Marple placed her teacup delicately on its saucer. Things had just become very interesting indeed. The stunned silence lasted only a moment before the whispers began in earnest. "She can't be back." What is she doing here after all these years? Did you hear? It's Vivian Denham. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, noted how the various guests reacted. Some, like Mrs. Weatherby, were alight with curiosity, already speculating on why Vivian had returned after so long. Others, like Colonel Godfrey, wore expressions of disapproval, as though the past had no right to resurface in such an unseemly manner. But it was Lady Margaret whose reaction was the most telling. The older woman had composed herself quickly, but her gloved hands were clenched tightly together, and there was a slight tremor in her voice as she finally spoke. "Vivian," as she said, stepping forward with the poise of a woman accustomed to maintaining appearances. "What an unexpected surprise." Vivian Denham smiled faintly. "Margaret, single word, but heavy with meaning." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward in her seat. "Oh, yes. There was history here." Not long after, Lady Margaret and Vivian Denham retired to the Manor's drawing room for what could only be described as a very private conversation. Miss Marple, ever the picture of polite detachment, had no intention of eavesdropping, but she had lived in villages long enough to know that one did not need to listen in order to understand. One merely needed to watch. From her vantage point, she could see Lady Margaret's tight grip on her teacup, the way she kept her back rigidly straight, as if preparing to defend herself. Vivian, on the other hand, was the picture of composure, her movements controlled, her voice smooth, her every gesture deliberate. But Miss Marple had seen enough theater in her day to recognize when someone was playing a part, and she had the distinct impression that Vivian Denham had not returned to St. Aldrich simply for a social visit. Then, quite suddenly, a gleam of gold caught Miss Marple's eye. Vivian had removed something from her coat pocket and placed it on the table between them. Locket. Lady Margaret's face went pale. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see that her hands were now trembling. The locket sat between them like a quiet accusation, and in that moment, Miss Marple knew the past was about to catch up with St. Aldrich in the most unexpected of ways. The return of Vivian Denham had sent ripples through St. Aldrich, much like a pebble cast into a still pond. By the time the last of Lady Margaret Fawcett's guests departed from the summer garden party, the village was already alive with speculation. At the Green Man, the local inn and gathering place, the usual hum of conversation had been overtaken by hurried whispers. Mrs. Weatherby and Mrs. Willoughby, the two most devoted purveyors of local gossip, were seated near the window, their heads bent together in fervent discussion. "Imagine the nerve of her, appearing like that," Mrs. Weatherby murmured, stirring her tea with unnecessary force. "Not a word for 20 years, and now she arrives as though nothing ever happened." Mrs. Willoughby, her round face flushed with excitement, shook her head. "I heard from Clara Redfern that Lady Margaret nearly fainted on the spot. What could she have wanted after all this time?" "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice to a near whisper. "She must be here for the fortune, of course." Mrs. Willoughby's eyes widened. "You don't mean Lady Margaret's late husband left everything to her?" Mrs. Weatherby interrupted, and with no direct air. "Who's to say Vivian doesn't have a claim?" The notion seemed scandalous enough to render Mrs. Willoughby momentarily speechless. Across the room, Colonel Godfrey, who had been nursing a brandy, let out a loud harumph. "Utter nonsense," he grumbled. "Vivian Denham was nothing but a troublemaker, and she's come back for one reason only, because she's in some kind of trouble." Several heads turned at that. Miss Marple, seated at her usual quiet table by the fireplace, merely sipped her tea and listened. It was always fascinating how people revealed more about themselves, or might speculated about others. She had no doubt that Vivian Denham's return was of great significance. But why now? And why had Lady Margaret gone so pale at the sight of that locket? That evening, Lady Margaret Fawcett sat in the dim glow of her drawing-room lamp, staring at the locket now resting on the polished mahogany table before her. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Opposite her, Vivian Denham reclined in an armchair, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then, at last, Lady Margaret broke the silence. "Where did you find it?" Vivian's red-lipped smile was slow, deliberate. "You always did know how to ask the most important questions, Margaret." Lady Margaret's fingers curled into fists atop her lap. The locket was. She stopped herself, inhaling sharply. "It should not be here." Vivian tilted her head. "And yet, here it is." A tense silence settled between them. Vivian reached forward, lifting the locket with delicate fingers. The gold chain gleamed in the firelight. "It was given to me," she said at last, her voice softer now. "Left behind in a place I never expected to find it." Lady Margaret's breath caught. "By whom?" Vivian held her gaze. "You already know the answer to that." Lady Margaret's eyes darkened. "That's impossible." Vivian merely smiled. For the first time, Lady Margaret's hands trembled. "Why are you really here, Vivian?" Vivian leaned back, her expression momentarily unreadable. "To uncover the truth, Margaret." A beat passed. Then, softly, she added, "And to remind you that some secrets never stay buried." The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Clara Redfern, post Mistress, if there was anyone who might have insight into the mysterious return of Vivian Denham. It was the woman who had spent years handling the village's correspondence. The post office was a small, well-kept building with wooden shelves neatly stacked with letters and parcels. Clara Redfern, a practical woman with a sharp eye and an excellent memory, looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Well, if it isn't our very own detective," she said with a knowing smile. "Poor bit of news, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Only a little curiosity, my dear." Clara chuckled. "I suppose it's about Vivian Denham." Miss Marple nodded. "She has certainly caused quite the stir." Clara Redfern pursed her lips, sorting through a stack of envelopes. "Can't say I was entirely surprised to see her again." Miss Marple tilted her head. Clara glanced around before lowering her voice. "A letter came for Lady Margaret about a fortnight ago. No return address, no sender name." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "Okay. And you suspect it was from Vivian?" Clara nodded. It was postmarked from London." The handwriting. She hesitated, then added, "It was familiar." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her handbag. A fortnight ago, 2 weeks before Vivian Denham turned to St. Aldrich, something had called her back. And if Miss Marple had learned anything in her long years of observation, it was this: the past never reemerges without reason. Miss Marple left the post office with a thoughtful expression. Vivian's return was not just a whim. She had been summoned, whether by circumstance or design. And then, of course, there was the locket. Why had Lady Margaret been so shaken at the sight of it? Miss Marple had seen enough of the world to recognize that objects often carried stories. A locket, particularly one kept hidden for so many years, was unlikely to be merely sentimental. It was a clue. But to what? As she walked past the churchyard, her steps slowed. She paused near the old stone wall, letting her gaze drift toward the weathered gravestones. A name caught her eye: Theodore Fawcett, Lady Margaret's late husband. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Could this mystery be tied not only to Lady Margaret, but to her late husband as well? And if so, what exactly had Vivian Denham come back to uncover? The village of St. Aldrich had been abuzz with whispers since the unexpected return of Vivian Denham. Speculation flourished like ivy on an untended wall, winding its way through morning tea gatherings, church pews, and the snug corners of the Green Man. Vivian had returned after 20 years, carrying with her a locket that had left Lady Margaret Fawcett visibly shaken, and Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, knew that there was more to the story than the villagers' idle chatter could uncover. A woman does not reappear after 2 decades without a purpose. And a locket does not resurface unless it has something to say. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way toward Rosewood Manor, walking at a steady, unhurried pace. The estate stood on the edge of the village, its grand facade softened by ivy-covered walls and flower-laden gardens. At the door, she was greeted by Mrs. Beckett, Lady Margaret's longtime housekeeper. "Oh, Miss Marple," the older woman said, wiping her hands on her apron. Come in, come in. Her ladyship has been in a dreadful state since that woman arrived." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "I imagine it must be quite an adjustment, having Miss Denham return so suddenly." Mrs. Beckett exhaled sharply. "Lady Margaret hasn't been herself, that's for certain. Won't eat properly, keeps pacing in her study. And that Locket, Miss Marple, it frightened the life out of her." Miss Marple clasped her hands. "Indeed. Tell me, Mrs. Beckett, did you ever see that locket before?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Not personally, no, but I've been here 30 years, and I remember whispers, servants' talk, you understand?" "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Servants often notice more than they're given credit for." Mrs. Beckett lowered her voice. "There was talk that someone years ago was supposed to have disappeared with that locket, or perhaps it was stolen. But no one ever mentioned it again, not until now." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against her handbag. "Tell me, dear, was this before or after Sir Theodore Fawcett's passing?" Mrs. Beckett's eyes darted toward the study door. "Before," she admitted. "Few months before his accident." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Sir Theodore Fawcett had died in a riding accident, so it had been said at the time. Now, Vivian Denham's return and the locket's reappearance, Miss Marple wondered if that accident had been quite so accidental after all. Lady Margaret was standing by the fireplace when Miss Marple entered the study. The room was dimly lit, despite the afternoon sun. The heavy curtains drawn against the outside world. She turned at the sound of the door, her face carefully composed. "Jane," she said, forcing a smile. "How kind of you to call." Miss Marple moved toward the settee, settling herself with deliberate ease. "Margaret, dear, I wonder if you might indulge an old friend's curiosity." Lady Margaret let out a soft, breathless laugh. "Curiosity? About what?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, about the past, mostly." Lady Margaret's smile faltered. "Jane, if this is about Vivian," Miss Marple interrupted her gently. "Oh, but it must be, my dear. She has come back after 20 years, bringing with her a locket that you clearly recognized." She tilted her head. "And yet, you did not look pleased to see it." Lady Margaret moved toward the sideboard, pouring herself a small brandy. "That locket," she said after a moment, "should never have come back." Miss Marple watched her closely. "Why?" Lady Margaret took a slow sip before setting the glass down. "'Cause it belonged to Theodore." Miss Marple remained quiet, allowing the weight of the statement to settle between them. Lady Margaret exhaled. "It was his once, a gift from his mother. He always carried it with him until the day he died." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the armrest. "Was it missing after his accident?" Lady Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, it was never found. A missing locket, a man's death, and now, 20 years later, the locket had reappeared in the hands of Vivian Denham." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, my dear, what was Vivian's connection to your late husband?" Lady Margaret let out a soft, bitter laugh. "She was in love with him." Miss Marple blinked. Lady Margaret turned, her expression one of tightly held control. "She adored him, worshipped him even. But she sighed. He never returned her feelings. Miss Marple absorbed this new information. And did Vivian ever cause trouble? Lady Margaret hesitated before answering. She was distraught when Theodore married me. She left St. Audreth not long after. Miss Marple studied her, and yet she has returned. Lady Margaret's grip tightened on her glass. Yes, she murmured, and I fear she has returned for vengeance. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her small cottage, knitting by the fire and contemplating all that she had learned. Vivian had loved Sir Theodore. Sir Theodore had died in an accident shortly before. The locket had gone missing, and now, decades later, that same locket had resurfaced. Coincidence? No, Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. Just as she was about to retire for the night, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Evelyn Trevelyan, looking pale and uneasy. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "I don't know who else to turn to." Miss Marple ushered her inside. "What is it, my dear?" Evelyn twisted her hands together. "It's about Vivian. I think she's lying." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "About what, dear?" Evelyn exhaled shakily. "About why she came back." Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but there was still something missing, something just beyond her grasp, and Miss Marple had a feeling that the truth, whatever it was much, much darker than she had first suspected. Miss Marple ushered Evelyn Trevelyan inside, noting the young woman's pale complexion and the faint tremor in her hands. Whatever had driven her to seek Miss Marple's help at this late hour was not mere curiosity, was fear. The sitting room of Miss Marple's cottage was warm, the fire crackling gently in the hearth. A tray of tea, set earlier in the evening, was still warm, and Miss Marple poured Evelyn a cup before settling into her own chair. "My dear," she said gently, "take a breath. Then tell me everything." Evelyn wrapped her fingers around the teacup, as if drawing warmth from it, before exhaling shakily. "It's about Vivian," she murmured. "I don't believe her story." Miss Marple's knitting needles lay idle in her lap. "Oh, and why is that, my dear?" Evelyn hesitated. "She claims she came back to settle unfinished business, but I overheard something tonight, something that makes me think she's hiding the real reason." Miss Marple's interest deepened. "Go on." Evelyn swallowed hard. "I was walking past Rosewood Manor earlier this evening, and I saw Vivian standing outside. She didn't notice me. She was speaking to someone, but I couldn't see who." Miss Marple tilted her head. "What did she say?" Evelyn licked her lips, her fingers tightening around the cup. She said, "If you don't tell the truth, I will. And I don't think either of us wants that." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And you didn't see the person she was speaking to?" Evelyn shook her head. "They were standing in the shadows." Look at Miss Marple. Whoever it was, they were afraid of her. I could hear it in their voice when they replied. They said, "You don't understand what you're doing." Miss Marple absorbed this. So Vivian Denham was not merely here to reclaim a lost past. She had a hold over someone, and it was enough to frighten them. She gave Evelyn a reassuring smile. "You did? Very well to come to me, my dear. This is quite useful information." Evelyn hesitated before speaking again. "Miss Marple, do you think this has something to do with Sir Theodore's death?" Miss Marple studied her closely. "What makes you ask that, dear?" Evelyn lowered her voice. "'Cause of the locket. Everyone says it belonged to Sir Theodore. But if that's true, and it was missing when he died, where has it been for 20 years? And why bring it back now?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. Evelyn had unknowingly stumbled upon the very question that had been troubling her. Where had the locket been for all these years? And what did it reveal? After Evelyn left, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence, her mind working through the tangled threads of the mystery. Vivian Denham had returned, not merely as an interloper, but as someone with knowledge, a person with leverage over another. Miss Marple's fingers twitched with the urge to untangle the truth. But she knew she needed more, and so she decided to take a late evening stroll. The village was silent, save for the rustling of the wind through the trees. Miss Marple walked toward Rosewood Manor, her footsteps light against the gravel path. She had no intention of intruding upon Lady Margaret at this hour. Instead, she approached the garden gate, where the roses climbed high along the stone walls. Something glinted faintly in the moonlight. Miss Marple knelt carefully and retrieved it. A cigarette case. She turned it over in her hands. It was silver, engraved with a TF. Her lips pursed. Theodore Fawcett. But what was it doing outside the manor? Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the gravel path leading away from the house. The prints. Light. Quick. Someone had been here recently, and they had left something behind the next morning. Miss Marple made her way to the Green Man, where she knew she would find Vivian Denham taking breakfast. Vivian sat by the window, impeccably dressed in a deep blue traveling suit, her gloved hands stirring her tea with lazy precision. Miss Marple approached with a pleasant smile. "Good morning, Miss Denham. Might I join you?" Vivian looked up, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Miss Marple. Seems we've much to talk about." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair opposite. "It has been quite the week, hasn't it?" Vivian smirked. "Indeed. You must be enjoying yourself immensely." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Why, my dear, it is not enjoyment I seek. It is merely understanding." Vivian tilted her head. "And what is it, precisely, that you wish to understand?" Miss Marple reached into her handbag and placed the silver cigarette case on the table. Vivian's expression did not change, but her fingers stilled against the handle of her teacup. Miss Marple smiled. "I found this near Rosewood Manor last night. I do wonder how it came to be there." Vivian exhaled slowly. "I imagine it belonged to Sir Theodore." "Oh yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but it has not been seen for quite some time." She leaned in ever so slightly. "Just like your locket." Vivian's lips pressed together. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. "That there are two missing objects that have suddenly reappeared. And I cannot help but wonder if they were not merely misplaced, but deliberately hidden." Vivian said nothing. Miss Marple continued. "Tell me, my dear, was Sir Theodore's death truly an accident?" A flicker of something doubt, guilt, crossed Vivian's face before she masked it with a cold smile. "That," she said, her voice carefully measured, "is something only the dead can answer." Miss Marple met her gaze, unblinking. "But the dead, my dear," she murmured, "always leave behind whispers." That night, as the village settled into stillness, a scream tore through the air. Miss Marple sat up in bed instantly, her heart hammering. Another cry, this time muffled. She grabbed her shawl and hurried toward the window, pushing it open. In the distance, near Rosewood Manor, a lantern's glow flickered wildly. Something had happened, something terrible. Miss Marple quickly gathered her things. The puzzle of the forgotten locket was far from over, and now it had turned deadly. The scream that pierced the still night air sent a ripple of alarm through the sleeping village of St. Aldrich. Miss Marple, already halfway to her dressing table, hastily wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, snatched up her oil lamp, and hurried out the door. Her cottage was not far from Rosewood Manor, where the sound had come from. As she stepped onto the narrow lane leading up to the grand estate, she could already see other villagers stirring, lanterns flickering in windows as heads peered out in curiosity and concern. By the time Miss Marple reached the front gates, a small crowd had begun to gather. Lady Margaret Fawcett, still dressed in her evening attire, but visibly shaken, stood near the entrance, her trembling hands gripping the iron railing. Mrs. Beckett, the housekeeper, was beside her, her face pale, as she clutched a woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders. And there, near the entrance of the garden terrace, stood Vivian Denham. She was frozen in place, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other hanging limply by her side. Her complexion, always so composed, was now deathly white. Something was very wrong. Miss Marple moved forward carefully, her eyes sweeping the darkened garden, where the soft glow of lanterns illuminated the scene. And then she saw it, near the edge of the terrace, sprawled in a heap against the marble balustrade, was a figure. Evelyn Trevelyan. Her body lay motionless on the stone. For a moment, there was only silence. Stan, Colonel Godfrey, who had just arrived, took command of the scene. "Tone. Touch her," he barked, stepping forward. "Someone fetch the doctor." Mrs. Beckett turned and fled into the house, while the rest of the assembled villagers held their collective breath. Miss Marple, however, moved forward, kneeling carefully beside Evelyn's still form. A slow, quiet exhale. She was breathing. Relief washed over Miss Marple, but it was brief. Evelyn's forehead was bruised, a long gash along her temple, and one of her wrists was bent at an unnatural angle. She had fallen, or rather, been pushed. Miss Marple glanced up, her sharp blue eyes scanning the balcony above the terrace. A stone balustrade ran along the second floor of the manor, overlooking the gardens. Had she fallen from there? And if so, had it been an accident? Within moments, Dr. Lawrence arrived, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Evelyn, his brows drawing together as he examined her injuries. "She survived," he announced after a tense silence, "but she's had quite the nasty shock. Likely fell from the second-floor terrace." He turned to Lady Margaret. "Did anyone see what happened?" Lady Margaret, still visibly shaken, shook her head. "No, I was asleep when I heard the scream." Vivian Denham, however, remained silent. Miss Marple noted this. The doctor continued, "She need rest. We must move her inside." With the help of the footman, they carried Evelyn into the manor, laying her carefully on a settee in the drawing room. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, took a seat in the corner, watching as Dr. Lawrence examined Evelyn further. After a few moments, the young woman stirred. A faint groan escaped her lips, and her eyelids fluttered open. "Miss Trevelyan," Miss Marple said softly. "He hear me, dear?" Evelyn's eyes darted around the room. Then, as though remembering what had happened, she inhaled sharply, struggling to sit up. "Careful," Dr. Lawrence said, gently pressing her back down. "You've had quite a nasty fall." Evelyn's hands gripped the fabric of the settee, her breath coming in quick bursts, and then her terrified gaze landed on Vivian Denham. Miss Marple did not miss the way Evelyn's fingers tightened. Vivian, for her part, held her gaze, but there was something in her expressions, something cold. "Evelyn, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "What happened?" Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, after a long moment, she whispered, "I saw something I wasn't supposed to." Silence fell over the drawing room. Vivian's gaze hardened, but Lady Margaret let out a soft gasp. "What do you mean, dear?" Miss Marple prompted. Evelyn swallowed hard. I was in the study. I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs. Tease. And then I heard voices." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Go on." Evelyn's breathing was unsteady. "I saw someone searching through the drawers." A ripple of unease moved through the room. Lady Margaret stiffened. "Searching? For what?" Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Then," she said, "the locket." A sharp intake of breath filled the room. Miss Marple's mind raced. The locket had already been found. It had been placed on the table between Vivian and Lady Margaret during their conversation, and yet someone had still been looking for it, which meant they had wanted to steal it back. Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward Vivian Denham, and there, just for a fraction of a second, she saw it a flicker of fear in Vivian's usually composed expression. She knew something, and, whatever it was, Evelyn had seen it. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in the study of Rosewood Manor, contemplating all she had learned. Something did not add up. If the locket was already in Lady Margaret's possession, why was someone still searching for it? Was there another locket? Or had something been hidden inside it? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned, expecting a maid, but instead she found herself face to face with Vivian Denham. Vivian stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands were clenched. "Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "you're making a mistake." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Am I, dear?" Vivian exhaled sharply. "Whatever you think you know, you don't." Miss Marple studied her closely. "You saying Evelyn was wrong?" Vivian's jaw tightened. "I'm saying that if you keep pushing, you won't like what you find." A warning. Miss Marple's lips curled into a gentle smile. "Oh, my dear," she said lightly. "I've been unraveling mysteries long enough to know that the truth always reveals itself." Vivian's fingers twitched then, without another word, she turned and left Miss Marple, exhaled slowly. Yes, the truth was coming to light, and someone in St. Aldris was desperate to keep it buried. Miss Marple sat by the fire in her small sitting room, her knitting lying untouched on her lap. The embers in the hearth crackled softly, casting long shadows along the walls. Vivian Denham's warning echoed in her mind. If you keep pushing, you won't like what you find. It was a foolish thing to say to someone like Miss Marple. Its very nature demanded that she push. The pieces of the mystery were beginning to form a clear picture. Sir Theodore's death, the missing locket, Vivian's return, Evelyn's near-fatal fall. And yet, the full shape of the truth remained just beyond her grasp. She reached for her handbag and withdrew the cigarette case she had found in the gardens of Rosewood Manor. The initials TF gleamed in the flickering VRELIGHT. Sir Theodore Fawcett had died 20 years ago in what was called a riding accident. His locket had disappeared that same night, and now both had reappeared. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the case. Lost in thought, had Theodore's death truly been an accident? Or had someone, all those years ago, made certain it appeared that way? The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Lawrence, the village physician. Under the pretense of inquiring about Evelyn Trevelyan's condition, she was shown into his study, where he greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. What can I do for you?" Miss Marple settled into a chair. "Oh, nothing of urgency, my dear doctor. I merely wish to inquire after Miss Trevelyan." Dr. Lawrence sighed, rubbing his temple. She was very lucky. Bit of a concussion, a broken wrist, but given the height she fell from, it could have been much worse. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. And yet, was it a fall at all? Dr. Lawrence frowned. "Do you mean?" Miss Marple leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I believe, my dear doctor, that someone pushed her." A heavy silence filled the room. Dr. Lawrence exhaled, then shook his head. "If that's true, Miss Marple, then it means there is something in this village worth killing for." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "My dear doctor, I do believe there is." She paused, then asked, "Tell me, Dr. Lawrence, you were practicing here when Sir Theodore Fawcett died, were you not?" Dr. Lawrence's expression darkened. "I was." "And was his death as straightforward as everyone believed?" Dr. Lawrence hesitated. Then, at last, he admitted, "I always had my doubts." Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Dr. Lawrence sighed. "It was ruled an accident. He was thrown from his horse while out riding. But," he paused, "there were things that didn't add up, such as—" Dr. Lawrence laced his fingers together. "1. The injuries didn't match the story." "Yes, He had the sort of wounds one would expect from a fall, but there was also something else, a blow to the back of his head. Miss Marple's lips pressed together, as though someone struck him. Dr. Lawrence exhaled heavily. I can't say for certain, but I always wondered if he was already unconscious before he fell. Miss Marple's sharp mind quickly connected the dots. Sir Theodore hadn't fallen from his horse. He had been struck, rendered unconscious, and then stage 2 make it look like an accident, and that Sir Theodore Fawcett had been murdered. Armed with this new knowledge, Miss Marple wasted no time. She returned to Rosewood Manor, where Lady Margaret greeted her with wary eyes. Jane, she said, leading her into the study. I had a feeling I'd see you today. Miss Marple took her usual seat, setting her handbag beside her. Margaret, dear, I believe it is time we spoke plainly. Lady Margaret stiffened. About what? Miss Marple folded her hands. Night, Sir Theodore died. A shadow passed over Lady Margaret's face. That was a tragic accident, Jane. Miss Marple shook her head. No, my dear, it was not. Lady Margaret's breath caught. Miss Marple pressed forward. You were told it was an accident, and for 20 years you believed it. But Margaret, Sir Theodore was struck on the head before he ever fell from that horse. Lady Margaret swayed slightly, gripping the arm of her chair. Doubt. Not possible. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the locket. She placed it gently on the table. Margaret, she said softly, Sir Theodore must have known something dangerous before he died. He had this locket with him when he left for his final ride. Lady Margaret stared at the delicate gold piece. She faltered. I don't understand. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Think carefully, dear. Was there anyone who had a reason to want him dead? Lady Margaret shuddered. Only one. Miss Marple held her breath. Lady Margaret's lips trembled as she whispered. Vivian. Blation settled heavily between them. Miss Marple exhaled. Then, my dear, I fear we may know the truth at last. Vivian Denham had loved Sir Theodore. She had returned to St. Aldrich after 20 years, but not simply to reclaim a lost past. She had come back to cover her tracks, because Evelyn had seen something, because the locket had reappeared, because Sir Theodore's murder was finally coming to light. Lady Margaret gripped the edge of the table. Jane, do you think Miss Marple, placed a hand over hers? My dear, Vivian has already attempted one murder. Lady Margaret paled. Miss Marple rose. And that means, my dear Margaret, that she won't stop now. A long silence. Then Lady Margaret whispered, What do we do? Miss Marple's voice was steady. We set a trap. That night, Miss Marple sent a note to Vivian Denham, requesting a private meeting at Rosewood Manor. The game was nearing its end. Vivian would come, and when she did, the truth would finally be revealed. The candlelight flickered in the drawing room of Rosewood Manor, casting long shadows on the paneled walls. Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression serene but keenly observant. Across from her, Lady Margaret Fawcett sat stiffly, her fingers twitching against the silk of her gown. Between them, resting on the table, lay the golden locket, the piece of jewelry that had set everything in motion. Outside, the night was thick with silence, the kind that stretched across the countryside like an unspoken warning. A single oil lamp glowed by the entrance, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Tonight, the trap would be sprung. Vivian Denham would come, and when she did, the truth long buried in deception and regret would finally come to light. 10:15. A soft knock echoed through the vast halls of Rosewood Manor. Lady Margaret flinched, but Miss Marple merely lifted her chin slightly. Shall I? She asked. Lady Margaret hesitated before nodding. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the door. She turned the brass handle and pulled it open. There stood Vivian Denham. She was wrapped in a deep emerald cloak, her hat perched at a deliberate angle, the feather curling like a question mark above her dark, unreadable eyes. Her hands were gloved, and in the dim glow of the oil lamp, she looked almost spectral. It's like a woman who had walked out of a past she had tried so desperately to leave behind. "Miss Marple," she said smoothly, "a surprise to see you here." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "Do come in, my dear." Vivian hesitated just a moment before stepping inside. Her eyes swept the room, noting the warm fire, the untouched tea set, and finally the locket, glinting on the table. Her breath hitched. Lady Margaret, still seated, did not speak. Miss Marple gestured to the armchair across from them. "Would you care for some tea, Miss Denham?" Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't believe I have time for tea, Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "Then perhaps just a few answers." Vivian's jaw tightened. "And what answers do you seek?" Miss Marple took a delicate sip of her tea before speaking. "The night Sir Theodore died," she said softly, "it was said to be an accident. But we now know that he was struck on the head before he ever fell from that horse." Vivian remained still, but her fingers curled ever so slightly around the edge of her cloak. "And, of course," Miss Marple continued, "his locket disappeared that very night." She glanced at the delicate piece of jewelry on the table. "Can yet. It has found its way back 20 years later." Vivian inhaled through her nose, her expression carefully controlled. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but unrelenting. "I believe, my dear, that you were there that night." A muscle in Vivian's cheek twitched. "And I believe that you have spent the last 20 years ensuring that no one ever uncovered the truth." Silence. Then, slowly, Vivian leaned forward, resting, her elbows on her knees. She studied Miss Marple for a long moment, and then she smiled. "You are rather remarkable, Miss Marple," she murmured. Miss Marple inclined her head. "So I have been told, my dear." Vivian's gaze darkened. "But tell me, if you already know the truth, why summon me here?" Miss Marple's smile never faltered. "'Cause, my dear, I needed you to say it." Vivian's expression froze. Lady Margaret let out a small gasp, covering her mouth with a trembling hand, and then the silence cracked. Vivian shot to her feet, knocking over the teacup beside her. "You know nothing," she hissed, her breath coming quickly now. Miss Marple, utterly composed, reached into the pocket of her cardigan and withdrew a small piece of folded parchment. Vivian's eyes widened. "See, my dear," Miss Marple continued, "when I examined the locket, I found something quite unexpected inside." She unfolded the parchment, laying it flat on the table. It was a letter, written in hurried, desperate scrawl. "Margaret, if anything happens to me, know this. It was no accident. I have discovered something dangerous, something I must tell you about when I return. Until then, I am keeping the locket safe. It is my only proof. Do not trust the name was missing." The ink had bled away, leaving nothing but a half-formed letter. Vivian's breath shuddered. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but unyielding. "You killed him, didn't you, Miss Denham?" Sharp intake of breath from Lady Margaret. Vivian's eyes darkened, but she did not deny it. Instead, she whispered, "He was going to ruin me." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Or was it that he knew your secret?" Vivian's fingers trembled. "He was a fool, thought he was clever, but he didn't understand, thought he could just walk away." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Walk away from you." A terrible, raw silence. Then, finally, Vivian exhaled shakily. "Yes," she whispered. Lady Margaret let out a strangled sound, pressing her fingers to her lips. "Dear God," Vivian's voice was suddenly sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "I loved him," she spat. "I would have done anything for him. But when he found out, when he discovered the truth, he tried to leave." Her hands clenched. "And I couldn't. I couldn't." "Let him." Miss Marple nodded. as though she had expected exactly this answer. "So, you struck him?" Vivian laughed, but there was nothing joyful in it. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only meant to stop him. But when I saw him on the ground, when I saw that he wasn't moving, I knew it was too late." A long pause. Then Miss Marple spoke once more, her voice infinitely gentle. "And the locket." Vivian's shoulders sagged. "I hid it," she admitted. I thought if I could just keep it away, no one would ever find out." Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "But, my dear, secrets always surface, no matter how deeply they are buried." Vivian closed her eyes, and then, at last, she surrendered. The door to the drawing room creaked open. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "You heard everything?" Miss Marple asked softly. Graves nodded. "Every word." Vivian Denham straightened her shoulders, taking a deep breath, and then, without a fight, she turned to face her fate. The mystery was over, and St. Aldrich could finally rest. Chapter 8. Echoes of the past in the days that followed Vivian Denham's shocking confession. A heavy quiet descended over the village of St. Aldrich. The excitement and speculation of the past week had given way to something deeper and unease that lingered in the quiet exchanges at the baker's shop, in muted conversations at the Green Man, and in the solemn nods shared across the churchyard on Sunday morning. Miss Marple felt it keenly as she walked slowly through the village, her sharp blue eyes discreetly observing the faces around her. It was always this way, she mused. The village would heal in time, would slip comfortably back into its familiar routines. Yet beneath the calm exterior, the scars of tragedy would remain, barely visible, but always present. She paused to greet Mrs. Weatherby, whose lips were pursed tightly as she fussed over a basket of fresh pastries outside the baker's shop. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Weatherby murmured, glancing over her shoulder as if wary of being overheard. Who would have imagined it? Vivian Denham, of all people, after 20 years, to return and, well, commit murder. Miss Marple adjusted the lace trim of her gloves, her voice calm and thoughtful. "Indeed, Mrs. Weatherby, it is rather a tragic business, I must agree." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes narrowed conspiratorially. "And all because of a locket. Fancy that. Though I must say, it does make one wonder what was in that letter you mentioned." Miss Marple smiled faintly, careful not to betray too much. "Rather, imagine it was something Sir Theodore wished to communicate to Lady Margaret, a warning, perhaps, or a secret he hoped she alone would understand." Mrs. Weatherby sighed dramatically. "Secrets? They always come to no good, Miss Marple. Best to air them in the open, I say." Miss Marple inclined her head gently, choosing not to point out Mrs. Weatherby's own fondness for village gossip. Instead, she bid the woman good day and continued her unhurried journey toward Rosewood Manor. Lady Margaret had remained secluded since Vivian's arrest, taking no visitors. But Miss Marple suspected that beneath the veneer of stoicism and carefully maintained dignity, Margaret Fawcett was feeling deeply shaken, perhaps even guilty. After all, the tragedy had unfolded within her own home, the center of her own life, approaching the grand manor. Miss Marple could see that the curtains were drawn, lending the great house a muted, somber appearance. Yet, as she raised her hand to knock, the door opened quietly before her. Mrs. Beckett, her face lined with exhaustion, greeted her softly. "Oh, Miss Marple, her ladyship said you'd be along. She's waiting in the drawing room." Miss Marple followed her down the hall, noting how very empty the manor felt, as if the shadow of the recent tragedy had seeped into its walls. Lady Margaret stood at the fireplace, her figure silhouetted against the glow. She turned slowly upon Miss Marple's entrance, her expression guarded yet softened by grief. "Jane," Lady Margaret greeted her, voice subdued, "I thought you might visit today." Miss Marple sat in the chair opposite her, noticing the lingering tremble in Margaret's hands. "I rather hoped you would receive me, my dear." Lady Margaret took a steadying breath before speaking. "I can't quite believe it. Vivian, of all people." Miss Marple's voice was gently probing. "You had your suspicions, did you not, Margaret?" A long silence filled the room before Lady Margaret replied. "Perhaps, but I never allowed myself to truly believe them. To do so would have meant admitting something deeply unpleasant, something I didn't wish to accept." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That Vivian had never truly left your lives behind." Lady Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of hidden truths pressing heavily upon her. "Huh? When Theodora died, there were whispers. Of course, Vivian's departure so suddenly after it all seemed too convenient. But Vivian was my friend once. To think her capable of murder, Teat, felt unthinkable." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression kind but firm. "But now, my dear, you must face the truth." Lady Margaret exhaled shakily, a painful clarity flickering across her face. Yes, she loved him so fiercely, and well, I knew Theodore's affections lay elsewhere, yet I pretended not to see the tension building. I always suspected there was more to his death, but I chose ignorance. Perhaps if I had been stronger, braver. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "One cannot bear the blame for the actions of others, Margaret. Vivian made her choices long ago." Lady Margaret turned slowly, her gaze drifting toward the small table where the locket still rested. She reached forward, lifting the delicate chain, watching the gold gleam softly in the lamplight. "After so many years hidden away," Lady Margaret murmured, "I wonder what other secrets Theodore took with him. Why couldn't he simply tell me openly?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. Perhaps he meant to, but fate intervened. Lady Margaret hesitated, then said softly, "I suppose we'll never truly know." Miss Marple's eyes flickered thoughtfully, her fingers knitting together in quiet contemplation. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Margaret. The truth has a curious way of surfacing eventually." Margaret met Miss Marple's gaze, understanding dawning slowly across her features. "You think there is still something hidden?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I think, my dear, that the past leaves echoes behind memories, clues, truths hidden in plain sight. We need only look carefully enough to find them." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Beckett entering quietly, a tea tray balanced in her hands, steadying it down on the table. The housekeeper hesitated. "If I may, ma'am, Miss Marple heard something peculiar earlier in the village. Mind you." Lady Margaret turned sharply. "Peculiar?" Mrs. Beckett nodded, lowering her voice instinctively. "The one who had the accident, Miss Evelyn Trevelyan. She told Dr. Lawrence something strange before she was sedated again. Something she saw before she fell." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened at once. "Did she say what it was?" Mrs. Beckett glanced between them nervously. "She said there was another figure on the terrace with Vivian. Someone else she didn't recognize, someone hidden in the shadows." She heard them arguing. Lady Margaret went pale. Another figure. Who could that possibly have been? Miss Marple straightened slowly, her mind quickening with possibilities. If someone else had been present the night Evelyn fell, the narrative had changed dramatically. Vivian had confessed, certainly, but had she truly acted alone? Or was someone else pulling the strings, quietly manipulating events behind the scenes? She turned toward Lady Margaret, voice calm but quietly urgent. "Margaret, think carefully. Besides Vivian, who else might have reason to fear Theodore's revelations? Else could he have threatened with his knowledge?" Lady Margaret hesitated, her gaze clouded by uncertainty. Theodore had business dealings, friendships, but none that seemed sinister. Unless, yes, Miss Marple prompted gently. Lady Margaret's voice dropped, fear creeping back into her eyes. "Andrew Braithwaite. My nephew. Theodore never quite trusted him. Said Andrew was impulsive, reckless. Theodore once told me Andrew would inherit nothing until he proved himself worthy. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she absorbed this new information. A fresh thread woven deftly into the intricate fabric of the mystery. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, Vivian's confession was not the end of our tale, but merely another beginning. Lady Margaret's hand closed tightly around the locket, fear and resolve battling in her expression. The shadows of the past were deeper than they had imagined. And somewhere among them, another killer might yet be waiting. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl calmly, knowing this puzzle was far from finished. The truth would emerge. As it always did, all she had to do was wait and watch. Chapter 8. Shadows and Reflections in the Aftermath of Vivian Denham's Arrest. A subdued hush descended over Rosewood Manor. It was as if the old house itself had drawn inward, holding its secrets tighter than ever. Miss Marple watched thoughtfully from her vantage near the tall windows of the drawing room, quietly knitting as police officers moved carefully through the corridors, taking careful inventory of Vivian's belongings and securing any evidence they could find. Lady Margaret sat stiffly on the edge of the brocade settee, fingers folded tightly on her lap, eyes distant. Occasionally, her gaze would drift to the empty armchair across from her, the chair where Vivian had sat only hours before, her composure cracking into raw, desperate truth. Inspector Graves, meticulous as ever, stood near the fireplace, jotting down notes and occasionally barking instructions to the young constable who hovered uncertainly at the threshold. "You'll send word when you've finished here." Lady Margaret's voice broke the silence, brittle but steady. Graves glanced at her briefly and nodded curtly. "Yes, Lady Margaret, though it might take some time." Vivian Denham left very little to chance. Every room is being thoroughly examined. "We'll keep you informed." As the inspector stepped out into the hall, Lady Margaret exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a moment. Miss Marple carefully laid her knitting down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Are you quite all right, Margaret?" she asked gently. Lady Margaret opened her eyes, managing a weary smile. "I hardly know, Jane. It's all rather overwhelming. I can scarcely believe that Vivian was capable of such ... of murder." She paused, voice faltering slightly. "I knew her once, truly knew her. How could I have been so blind to what was inside her?" Miss Marple regarded her old friend thoughtfully. "It is often the ones we believe we know best who surprise us most profoundly. People hide depths that even they themselves may not fully understand. But rest assured, my dear, you are not responsible for her actions." Lady Margaret nodded faintly. "Perhaps not. But even so, I cannot shake the feeling of guilt. She came back here, Jane too, my home, my family, after all these years, and I welcomed her back as though nothing had changed." Miss Marple reached over gently, placing her hand atop Lady Margaret's. "You mustn't blame yourself. Guilt, I'm afraid, is a natural companion to grief, but the truth is rarely simple. Vivian carried secrets heavier than any of us understood." Lady Margaret sighed deeply. "Yes, in the village I can only imagine what they're saying now. Poor Evelyn Trevelyan nearly died because of Vivian. Theodore, my husband, all these years believing it an accident, never knowing the truth." Miss Marple's eyes softened sympathetically. "It is difficult, yes, to discover that a tragedy you've mourned for so long was never accidental. But at least now you have the closure of certainty." "Closure," Margaret echoed bitterly. "A hollow comfort, it seems, when all that's left behind is doubt." Before Miss Marple could respond, footsteps echoed softly across the polished hallway floor. Both women turned to see Andrew Braithwaite standing at the doorway, his expression hesitant and strained. "Aunt Margaret," he said quietly, stepping forward. Inspector Graves says the house will be cleared soon enough, but it might take longer than expected. They're being rather thorough. Lady Margaret gave a weary nod. Thank you, Andrew. You've been most helpful. Kay, I'm terribly sorry you've had to see the family home like this. Andrew glanced toward Miss Marple, offering a faint, forced smile before turning back to his aunt. I suppose we shall all have to manage as best we can, given what's happened. Miss Marple regarded the young man closely. Andrew's stance was rigid, shoulders tense, eyes flickering restlessly about the room. His easy charm and carefree smile from the garden party now seemed distant and dimmed by worry. Andrew, Miss Marple asked gently, did you know Vivian Denham at all before her return? He hesitated, clearly startled by the question. No, Miss Marple. I only knew of her. The stories. Mostly she was rather infamous around here, wasn't she? Indeed, Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, her eyes never leaving his face. But sometimes stories conceal as much as they reveal. Did she speak to you at all during her visit? Andrew shifted uncomfortably, only briefly. Nothing meaningful. Why do you ask? Miss Marple offered a mild smile. Oh, just curiosity. Vivian seemed rather intent on connecting with the past. Sometimes that means reaching out to family, even distant relations. Andrew paled slightly, but quickly masked it, forcing another casual smile. I suppose she did seem fixated on family secrets, didn't she? But she found nothing interesting from me. Lady Margaret looked up sharply. Andrew, is there something you're not telling us? Huh? He shook his head quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. Of course not, Aunt Margaret. There's nothing more to it. He excused himself hastily, departing through the doorway with nervous strides. Miss Marple watched him go thoughtfully, her knitting needles clicking quietly in contemplation. Lady Margaret's brows knitted together in concern. You think Andrew knows something else? Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured softly. People react to stress in peculiar ways. It's possible he's simply overwhelmed. But, Margaret prompted urgently. Miss Marple set aside her knitting carefully, fixing her keen gaze upon her friend. But Vivian's words, her actions, they suggested she wasn't alone in keeping secrets. This tragedy has a way of pulling on threads long hidden, Margaret. The past rarely sleeps peacefully. Lady Margaret shuddered slightly. Do you believe Vivian had an accomplice? Miss Marple pursed her lips thoughtfully. Accomplice. Maybe too strong a word. Perhaps someone merely influenced by her return. Someone who stood to lose a great deal if the full truth came to light. Lady Margaret closed her eyes briefly. More secrets, more doubts. Tea never ends. Miss Marple reached out gently once more. But it will, Margaret. The truth always surfaces, eventually. It is the very nature of truth to refuse concealment forever. A quiet knock at the drawing room door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Lawrence stepped inside, his expression serious. Forgive my intrusion, Lady Margaret. Evelyn Trevelyan wishes to speak with Miss Marple. She's awake now, and quite insistent. It's Lady. Margaret exchanged a quick glance with Miss Marple. Of course, please, Jane, go to her. Perhaps Evelyn remembers something more clearly now. Miss Marple rose smoothly from her chair, collecting her knitting bag. Certainly, I'll go at once. She left Rosewood Manor moments later, walking slowly through the village toward Dr. Lawrence's surgery, her thoughts clouded with quiet contemplation. She knew that Evelyn had glimpsed something important, something vital. But would Evelyn now recall exactly what she'd seen clearly enough to unravel the remaining threads? When she arrived, Evelyn was seated up slightly in her hospital bed, pale but alert. The young woman's eyes widened in relief at seeing Miss Marple. Miss Marple, she whispered urgently. Thank heaven you've come. Miss Marple settled into the chair beside the bed, offering a reassuring smile. Take your time, my dear. Tell me everything you remember. Evelyn hesitated, gathering herself. The night I fell, Vivian wasn't alone. I didn't see the face clearly, but there was someone else. Okay? They were arguing fiercely about the locket, about Theodore, but there's something else. Miss Marple. Yes, dear. Miss Marple encouraged gently. Evelyn's voice lowered, eyes darting nervously around the room before settling back on Miss Marple's face. It was someone I knew, someone trusted in St. Aldrich, someone no one would ever suspect. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled in her lap. Who? Evelyn? Who was it? Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, shuddering at the memory. I can't be entirely sure, but it sounded like. But before Evelyn could finish, Dr. Lawrence appeared hurriedly in the doorway, his expression grim. Miss Marple, you'd better come quickly. There's been another incident. Miss Marple stood swiftly, heart racing slightly as Evelyn gasped beside her. What's happened? Miss Marple asked urgently. It's Andrew Braithwaite, Dr. Lawrence said, breathlessly. He's disappeared. Cutes. And there's blood in his study. Miss Marple exhaled sharply, steeling herself. The truth, it seemed, was not done with St. Aldrich yet. Chapter 9. Echoes in the dark. Andrew Braithwaite's sudden disappearance had plunged St. Aldrich into a state of near panic. The discovery of blood in his study, along with his conspicuous absence, had reignited fear in the village, shaking its vocative tranquil normality once more. News traveled swiftly through the narrow lanes and across neatly trimmed gardens, whispered from doorstep to doorstep with growing alarm. Inspector Graves had summoned constables from neighboring market chipping, their presence unsettling the villagers who watched anxiously behind drawn curtains. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, her keen eyes sharper than ever, had returned to Rosewood Manor, certain that answers lay buried beneath the layers of secrecy and silence within those ancient walls. Lady Margaret had grown increasingly withdrawn, her confidence faltering under the burden of uncertainty. Miss Marple, always observant, noted that while Margaret expressed concern for her nephew, there was something else in her eyes, something darker, more complicated than mere familial worry. Margaret, Miss Marple began gently, seated again in the drawing room. This new development with Andrew, it's troubling. I know. Lady Margaret nodded, her gaze fixed on the ornate mantelpiece. Her lips pressed tightly together. Andrew has always been impulsive, Lady Margaret said, quietly, but never violent. Never reckless enough to simply vanish, especially not with all that has happened. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Yet, you are troubled, Margaret. There's something else that concerns you, isn't there? Lady Margaret sighed deeply, glancing toward the empty chair Vivian had occupied the previous evening. Andrew had become restless recently. He was asking questions about the past, about Theodore's accident. I dismissed it as idle curiosity, but perhaps I was wrong. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched in her lap. You suspect Andrew discovered something. Lady Margaret's fingers twisted in her lap. He had been poring over Theodore's old journals in the days before Vivian arrived. At first, I thought it harmless curiosity, but then I overheard him speaking to Vivian in the garden. They were arguing. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did you hear what was said? Lady Margaret shook her head. Only fragments. Andrew accused Vivian of deception, and Vivian accused him of naivety. She warned him to leave things alone, to let the past remain buried. Andrew, of course, refused. Miss Marple absorbed this thoughtfully. Andrew Braithwaite had been pursuing the same threads she herself had begun to unravel. Had he stumbled upon something dangerous enough to silence him? And now he has disappeared, Miss Marple said softly. Do you believe he could be in danger? Lady Margaret met her gaze, eyes shadowed. I don't know, but I fear he uncovered something he shouldn't have, and that someone is desperate enough to silence him. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Her suspicions deepened. Andrew had indeed discovered something, But what had prompted him to confront Vivian Denham directly? Had Vivian been the source of the danger, or merely a catalyst for something darker still? As Lady Margaret retreated into weary silence, Miss Marple rose, moving toward the hallway. "I shall speak to Inspector Graves at once," she said calmly. "We must act quickly. If Andrew is alive, there may be precious little time." Lady Margaret turned toward her sharply. "Schneef, Vivian was not acting alone. Who else could possibly be involved? Who else in St. Aldreth would dare commit such acts?" Miss Marple paused at the door, her voice gentle yet firm. "Someone, my dear, who has lived among us, hidden behind a very convincing mask. Someone trusted, perhaps even beloved. A someone we have overlooked entirely." Lady Margaret's lips parted, but she did not speak. Miss Marple saw fear bloom anew in her friend's eyes, knowing full well that the darkest of truths often lay closest to home. Miss Marple made her way swiftly through the village, the evening sky darkening to deep indigo above her. Lanterns glowed softly along the streets, casting pools of gentle light that seemed insufficient against the darkness of suspicion now hanging over St. Aldreth. She found Inspector Graves at the small police station near the Green Man Inn, pacing the small room with irritation. "Ah, Miss Marple," Graves said gruffly, motioning her in. "I've been searching everywhere. Andrew's disappearance has complicated everything." Miss Marple took the seat offered, her demeanor composed, but determined. "Inspector, I fear we are dealing with something far more intricate than we first believed." Graves raised a skeptical eyebrow. "More intricate than murder, blackmail, and a decades-old cover-up." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, unruffled. "Vivian Denham certainly had reason enough to harm Sir Theodore, perhaps even Evelyn. But Andrew Braithwaite's disappearance does not fit neatly into Vivian's motives. Someone else, someone with equal or even greater stakes in keeping these secrets hidden, is at work here." Graves sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "And who would that be?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled sharply. "Someone who knew precisely what Theodore discovered all those years ago. Someone he trusted implicitly." Graves leaned forward. "You suspect someone else within the family?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. Vivian admitted she acted in desperation, but desperation rarely travels alone. Theodore's death was carefully staged as an accident, which suggests someone else aided in concealing it. Graves exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're suggesting a conspiracy, then?" "A partnership, rather," Miss Marple corrected. Vivian Denham had every reason to keep Theodore's murder concealed, but she lacked the influence within St. Aldreth to ensure the truth remained buried. She needed an ally, someone who would gain just as much from silence. Graves frowned thoughtfully. "Lady Margaret." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Margaret has nothing to gain by harming Andrew. Her distress is genuine. But there is another person who has quietly benefited from Theodore's death." Graves narrowed his eyes. "Andrew Braithwaite himself." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Andrew certainly had his suspicions, but his absence now suggests he has become a threat to this hidden partner. If we wish to find him alive, we must unravel the threads that led Theodore to his death. We must return to the source of it all." Graves sighed. "And what exactly is that source?" Miss Marple's expression grew serious. "Rosewood Manor itself. I believe the key lies hidden there within the study Theodore kept, untouched since his death. The place he would hide something if he discovered a dangerous secret." Graves stood abruptly. "Then that's where we'll go." "Now?" Miss Marple rose calmly, adjusting her shawl. "I believe, Inspector, it may already be too late for caution. Whoever fears discovery would not hesitate to act again." Graves gave a grim nod. "Then let us hope we are quicker than they are." The darkness had deepened further by the time they reached Rosewood Manor. The vast house stood silent and ominous, lit only by a faint glow from within. Miss Marple and Graves entered quietly, moving quickly toward the study, the room where Theodore Fawcett had spent his final days, and where Andrew Braithwaite had so recently been attacked. As they approached, Miss Marple paused. The study door stood slightly ajar, and she could hear the faint rustling of papers inside. Graves drew his pistol. Stepping forward cautiously, Miss Marple stayed close behind, heart beating rapidly in her chest. This was the moment when the truth hidden so long in shadows would finally emerge. Graves pushed open the door swiftly, the hinges creaking ominously. Inside, a figure spun around abruptly, startled. It was Andrew Braithwaite, shriveled, pale, and clearly frightened. "Inspector," he gasped. "You must listen, there isn't much time." But before Graves could speak, another sound echoed sharply through the room, a clicking of heels on polished floorboards. Miss Marple turned swiftly. There, twained in the doorway, stood Lady Margaret Fawcett, her eyes glittering darkly, a revolver held steadily in her hand. "Forgive me, Jane," she said quietly, "but I cannot allow this to continue." Chapter 10. Truth in the Shadows. Andrew Braithwaite stood rigidly in the center of the study, his face pale beneath the harsh glow of the oil lamps. His clothes were disheveled, streaked with dirt, and a jagged cut across his forehead had only recently stopped bleeding. In his trembling hands, he held a bundle of papers hastily gathered from the desk, papers yellowed with age and inked in. A hurried hand at the doorway, Inspector Graves moved cautiously forward, his gaze flickering warily between Andrew and Lady Margaret, who had appeared silently in the doorway behind him. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the mantelpiece, kept her sharp blue eyes focused firmly upon Lady Margaret. Noting the way her breathing quickened, her fingers gripping the edges of her shawl with barely concealed tension. "Andrew," Graves said slowly, raising a calming hand. "What exactly is going on here?" Andrew drew in a ragged breath. "I've been hiding since last night. I knew whoever attacked me would still be close by, so I had to make sure they believed I'd left the village entirely. But I had to come back. There was something important in this study, something my uncle left behind." Lady Margaret took a shaky step forward, her voice sharp with anxiety. "Andrew, stop this nonsense at once. You have frightened us all half to death. Why disappear if you were innocent?" Andrew's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "'Cause I knew someone in this house wanted me silenced. I barely escaped the first time someone struck me from behind while I was reading Uncle Theodore's papers. They must have thought they'd finished the job, but I came to in the garden and fled to safety." Miss Marple cleared her throat softly, drawing their attention with effortless grace. "And what exactly, Andrew, were you looking for among your uncle's papers?" Andrew hesitated, casting a wary glance at his aunt before speaking. "Proof that Uncle Theodore's death wasn't an accident. Proof that someone in this household helped conceal the truth." Lady Margaret swayed slightly, gripping the doorframe for support. "This is madness," she whispered. "Theodore's death was tragic enough without resurrecting old ghosts." Miss Marple turned gently, but her voice was firm. "My dear Margaret, ghosts often linger precisely because truths are buried prematurely." Lady Margaret flinched visibly, turning her gaze toward Miss Marple with something like desperation. "Jane, surely you can't believe this. Theodore's accident was tragic enough without this dreadful speculation." Inspector Graves stepped forward, raising a hand to interrupt. "We already have reason to suspect foul play, Lady Margaret. Sir Theodore was struck on the head before he fell, an injury inconsistent with an accidental fall." Lady Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her throat. "But that's impossible. Theodore was well loved by everyone." Miss Marple moved quietly toward Andrew, her voice gentle yet commanding. "Andrew, you said You were looking for proof. Did you find anything? Andrew took a deep breath before answering, carefully withdrawing a folded sheet from his coat pocket. He handed it wordlessly to Inspector Graves, who unfolded it and held it near the lamp. His eyes widened as he read. It's a letter from Sir Theodore himself, written shortly before he died. Lady Margaret went deathly still. Miss Marple watched her carefully, noticing the subtle trembling of her friend's fingers as she listened. Inspector Graves read aloud, his voice grave. Margaret, I fear I may have uncovered something that puts us all in danger. Vivian knows more than she's letting on, but there is someone else who frightens me even more. If anything should happen to me, know this: it was not an accident. Someone wants me silenced, someone within this house, and I fear that person may be far closer than we ever suspected. Graves lowered the letter, his gaze settling upon Lady Margaret with cold suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the way Lady Margaret had gone utterly still, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the sideboard. You knew, didn't you, Margaret? Miss Marple said softly. You always knew this wasn't merely an accident. Lady Margaret's face contorted briefly, betraying a flash of anguish before she regained control. No, Jane, you misunderstand. Theodore was agitated near the end. I never believed him capable of rational judgment at that time. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, voice gentle yet penetrating. And yet, my dear, your very first reaction to seeing Vivian Denham's return and the locket she carried suggested otherwise. You reacted with fear, Margaret, not mere surprise. Why? Lady Margaret took a shaky breath, eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape. Because that locket was lost years ago. It should never have resurfaced. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed quietly. It vanished the night Theodore died, just as you told me. Lady Margaret's gaze dropped, her voice barely above a whisper. But I had nothing to do with his death. Jane, you must believe that. Miss Marple studied her carefully, considering her words. I do not believe you killed him, Margaret. Okay. But you feared someone else did. Someone you chose to protect. Someone you have shielded all these years. A heavy silence settled over the room. Inspector Graves exchanged an uneasy glance with Miss Marple, the realization dawning in his expression. You've known all along, haven't you, Lady Margaret? Graves asked, voice steely with accusation. You knew who killed your husband and kept it hidden. Lady Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Inspector, please, cannot imagine what it's been like living with this shadow. Okay, I had to protect. Miss Marple interrupted gently but firmly. Whom, Margaret? Whom have you protected all these years? Lady Margaret's voice cracked with desperation. Vivian. I thought it was Vivian who killed Theodore. I believed it for years. I knew she had loved him obsessively, that she was jealous and desperate. I told myself it must have been her. That belief allowed me to carry on. But now, now I no longer know. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice low but compassionate. Vivian certainly concealed the locket, but there is more to this than mere jealousy. Vivian was desperate, yes, but only because she feared the truth might destroy her. Someone else orchestrated Theodore's death, someone who has lived comfortably, unchallenged, behind Vivian's convenient facade. Andrew Braithwaite stared at his aunt, realization dawning in his eyes. You accuse Vivian to protect someone else. Lady Margaret nodded slowly, defeated. Someone who was always here. Someone I loved and trusted, but now I don't know who I've been protecting. Miss Marple exhaled softly, casting her eyes toward the shadowed corners of the room. But I rather think, my dear Margaret, that the real murderer is still very close, indeed waiting, listening. And their hand has already been forced. The room fell into a charged silence. The very walls seemed to hold their breath, Then, from somewhere deep within the manor, muffled sound of movement. Footsteps retreating quickly into the darkness. Inspector Graves sprang into action. Quickly, there, escaping. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her expression serene despite the chaos erupting around her. The final mask was about to fall, the last secret to be unmasked. Whoever fled through Rosewood Manor's corridors now carried with them the ultimate truth. But Miss Marple had anticipated this. The trap had been set with utmost care, and there was no escape from the truth waiting at the end of the shadowed halls. Chapter 11. The final 3-day cold. Uneasy silence filled Rosewood Manor as Inspector Graves's footsteps echoed down the hall, giving chase to the shadow that had slipped away moments before. Miss Marple stood motionless in the drawing room, her eyes reflecting the soft flicker of candlelight, watching Lady Margaret's trembling figure sink into the nearest chair. The older woman seemed suddenly aged beyond her years, burdened by a truth she'd long carried but never fully understood. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rattling the ancient windows. Miss Marple felt no urgency. She knew how these things ended. A fleeing figure would not get far. They never did. The truth, once disturbed, had a habit of wrapping itself around the guilty like an invisible snare, pulling them inevitably back to the place where it all began. Miss Marple turned toward Andrew Braithwaite, who was leaning heavily against the fireplace mantel, his expression tight with disbelief. "It's over, isn't it, Miss Marple?" he murmured softly, running his fingers through disheveled hair. "After all these years, we'll finally know what really happened to Uncle Theodore." Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile, filled with quiet compassion. "Oh yes, my dear. But I fear the truth might be far more painful than any of us imagined." Lady Margaret looked up sharply, her face pale, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Jane, I don't understand. Who could possibly have wished Theodore harm besides Vivian?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "My dear Margaret, Vivian Denham concealed Theodore's locket. Yes, but murder was never in her nature. Jealousy and obsession, certainly, but Vivian loved Theodore too deeply to harm him deliberately." "Then who?" Lady Margaret's voice faltered, disbelief etched into every line of her face. Miss Marple gently clasped her hands. "Someone Theodore trusted implicitly. Someone who stood to gain greatly from his death. But most importantly, someone who had access not just to him but to the manor, the locket, and his deepest secrets." Andrew drew a sharp breath. "You can't me." But before Miss Marple could answer, the study doors opened abruptly, and Inspector Graves stepped in, gripping firmly by the arm a struggling figure whose cloak was disheveled, her hair wild and tangled, eyes wide with panic and desperation. It was Clara Redfern. Lady Margaret rose unsteadily, clutching the arm of her chair. "Clara, but why?" Miss Marple regarded the postmistress with a gentle sadness. "My dear Clara, I'm afraid it was the letters that first gave you away." Clara's eyes flashed dangerously. "You don't understand. None of you ever did. I had no choice." Inspector Graves tightened his grip on her arm. "You had better explain yourself clearly, Miss Redfern. We've heard enough lies." Clara shuddered, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking. 20 years. I kept my silence for 20 years. Do you think it was easy, watching all of you go on as if nothing had happened, while I carried the truth, night after night?" Miss Marple nodded softly. "You loved him, didn't you, Clara? But it was more than love, was obsession. You watched Theodore marry Margaret, watched as Vivian made her feelings so openly known, yet no one ever saw you. You were invisible to them, always present, yet forever unseen. That, my dear, can drive one to desperation." Clara's lips trembled. "I only wanted him to see me, to notice me. even once. But he never did. Vivian had his attention. Margaret had his name and fortune, but I had nothing. Only secrets I discovered in letters, never meant for my eyes. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but her voice was firm. And one day, you discovered something so dangerous, it gave you the power, you craved the power to destroy Theodore, or to control him. But he wouldn't be controlled, would he? Clara shook her head slowly. No, he knew what I'd done. He confronted me, exposed me, everything I had built, okay? And I panicked. I didn't mean to kill him, just to stop him, just to silence him for a moment. Lady Margaret was trembling, her eyes bright with pain. And you let Vivian take the blame? For 20 years, you let us suspect her. Clara's voice broke, defiant. Yet pleading, she fled. Vivian vanished, took the locket with her, thought it was proof that she'd done it. I could finally breathe again, till she returned, bringing that accursed thing back. Inspector Graves cleared his throat, heavily. And Evelyn Trevelyan. Did she discover your secret? Clara nodded slowly. Evelyn found the letters hidden in the Locket letters that revealed Theodore's true intentions. He planned to expose me for intercepting Vivian's letters to him, to reveal that I had manipulated him. When Evelyn confronted me, I had no choice. I didn't want to harm her, but I couldn't let the truth come out. Not after everything. Lady Margaret sank back into her chair, eyes wide with shock. 20 years of lies and deceit, Clara. Was it worth it? Clara's voice was barely audible, brittle with regret. No, it wasn't. Not even for a moment. Inspector Graves stepped forward decisively, signaling to his constable, who gently took Clara by the arm, leading her from the room in stunned silence. The door closed softly behind them, leaving Miss Marple, Lady Margaret, and Andrew Braithwaite alone in the dim glow of the study. Andrew sank heavily into a chair, rubbing a shaking hand over his eyes. I can hardly believe it. All these years, Clara Redfern of all people. Miss Marple moved closer to Lady Margaret, gently placing a comforting hand upon her friend's shoulder. I am sorry, Margaret. Times the truth is harder to bear than ignorance. Lady Margaret exhaled slowly, eyes shining with quiet grief. And yet, Jane, it is still better to know, isn't it? Miss Marple smiled softly. Yes, my dear. In the end, it always is. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed softly, marking the passage of another hour. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky with streaks of gold and soft pink, chasing away the darkness that had hung over Rosewood Manor for 2 decades. With Clara Redfern's confession, the shadow that had haunted St. Aldrich was finally lifted. Days later, the village of St. Aldrich slowly returned to the rhythm of normal life, though the air was thick with the memory of the tragedy. At the Green Man, villagers whispered quietly of Clara's arrest, marveling at how quiet, respectable lives could conceal so dark a truth. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the peaceful activity of the village unfold once more beneath a sunlit sky. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she reflected on the case and love twisted into obsession, truth hidden by lies, and the quiet desperation that had driven Clara Redfern to commit murder. Miss Marple knew that life in the village would go on as it always did, secrets fading into stories whispered over teacups and garden fences. But she also knew that the scars of this tragedy would linger quietly beneath the surface, as reminders of how fragile trust could be. As she watched the gentle bustle of life resume, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of peace. She knew this was not the last mystery she would unravel. There would always be another puzzle, another hidden truth. But today, at least, she could rest. For in St. Aldrich, justice had been served, and the past could finally sleep.